Hey there, it's CaraNightly, and tonight I have with me the Shalai Hallar Commander deck from Magic the Gathering. Now this is the actual pre-con or pre-constructed deck, but my husband and I have removed items, added items, and really just rebuilt the deck. I will have a link to the Moxfield deck list for the deck I have here tonight in the description, if you are interested in seeing that. Otherwise, stay tuned as I will be reading through all of the cards in the deck here with you tonight. I hope you find this relaxing and enjoyable at the same time. Okay, this is Dragon Shield brand sleeves. I believe this is the peach color. Peach. Okay. So let's begin with the tokens. So tokens are cards that come into play as you are playing the game. Usually a card that you cast will create, say, a treasure token. So this deck has just a few different tokens that are required for it. So let's get started with the commander of the deck. So this is Shalai and Hallar. It costs 1 generic, a mountain, a forest, and a plains. It's a legendary creature and an angel elf. It has flying, vigilance. Whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, Shalai and Hallar deals that much damage to target opponent. It is a 3/3. So this deck is all about +1/+1 counters, proliferating, just generating and duplicating counters. Then we have the off commander, I guess, or the card that sort of pairs well with the commander. This is Bright Palm Soul Awakener. It costs a generic, a mountain, a forest, and a plains. It's a legendary creature, a fox shaman. It has backup which backup means when this creature enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. If that's another creature, it gains the following ability until end of turn. Whenever this creature attacks, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature. That creature can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less this turn. And it is a 4/3. Okay, I really like the art on that card. Next we have Vigor. Vigor is 3 generic and 3 forest. It's a creature elemental incarnation. It has trample. If damage would be dealt to a creature you control other than Vigor, prevent that damage. Put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. When Vigor is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into the owner's library. It is a 6/6. So that's a pretty sweet card. A little pricey to cast, but a really good card. Next we have Helena and Elena, partners, 2 generic and a mountain and a forest. It's a legendary creature, a human ranger. It has first strike, reach. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is Helena and Elena's power. That creature gains haste until end of turn, and this is a 2/3. Apologies if you hear any sounds in the background. That is my German Shepherd puppy on my bed. I'm trying to get him to sit still, but that's not always possible. Anyways. This next card is my favorite, Birds of Paradise. It costs 1 forest. It's a creature bird. It has flying, and you can tap the card and add 1 mana of any color. The flavor text reads, "Its brilliant plumage painted streaks of color across a sky long darkened by war." I really like the art of this card. Next we have Evolution Sage. That is very hard to say together for me. It costs 2 generic and a forest. It is a creature elf druid. It has landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. And proliferate means to choose any number of permanent and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. Flavor text reads, "To care for yourself, cultivate the world. To care for the world, cultivate yourself." Now that is some meaningful text. Mana Gorger Hydra. I love Hydra cards. This costs 2 generic and a forest. It is a creature Hydra. It has trample. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Mana Gorger Hydra. And it's a 1/1 to start, but I must admit this card gets big very quickly. It's one of my favorites. we have Micaeus the Lunarch. Micaeus the Lunarch is a legendary creature, human cleric. It costs X generic mana and a plains. And Micaeus the Lunarch enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Then you can tap this card and put a +1/+1 counter on Micaeus, or you can tap and remove a +1/+1 counter from Micaeus and put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. It is a 0/0, but putting some counters on him will do a lot. So this is a really good card. Now, I am going through this by card types if you haven't noticed already. So we are starting with the creatures, and then I will have the other ones in here. So next up is the Colonian Hydra. It costs 3 generic, 2 forest. It's a creature Hydra, so again, one of my favorites. It has trample. Colonian Hydra enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever Colonian Hydra attacks, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. It's a 0/0. So again, starts off small, but gets very big and does a lot of things. So this is a great card. Next we have Conclave Mentor. It costs a forest and a plains. I really like this card. Kind of a helping hand here. He's a creature, centaur cleric. If one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. And then when Conclave Mentor dies, you gain life equal to its power. It's a 2/2, costs 2, and that's a pretty good deal. So I really like that card too. Next we have Dusk Legion Duelist. It is 1 generic and 1 plains, creature, vampire soldier. It has vigilance. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Dusk Legion Duelist, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. I never like seeing that text, but it's there for a good reason. The flavor text reads, "We sailed to Ixalan, guided by a promise, the age of ever-flowing blood. No machine will take that from us." It's a 2/2. Biophagus. It costs 1 generic and 1 forest. It's a creature, human tyrannid wizard. Tyrannid wizard. And you can tap and add 1 mana of any color. If the mana is spent to cast a creature spell, that creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. The flavor text reads, "We guarantee you that within a week you will feel like a new man." Abzan Falconer. It is 2 generic and a plains. It's a creature, human soldier. Outlast for 1 plains. And when you outlast, you pay the plains and then you tap the card and you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. You can outlast only as a sorcery. And then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has flying. I love that ability. Flavor text reads, "The fastest way across the dunes is above." And then this card is a 2/3. Gyre Sage costs a generic and a forest. It's a creature, elf druid, has evolve. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. You can tap and add a forest for each +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage. And this is a 1/2. This is a really, really, really good card. I love having this one when I play this deck. Ooh, Forcinclex Monstrous Raider. Costs 4 generic and 2 forest. It's a legendary creature, a Phyrexian Praetor. It has trample haste. If you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many on each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. If an opponent would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many on each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. Wah, wah. It's a 6/6. This is a mean card, but a powerful card. Incubation Druid, another mana generating card that I love to have. It costs 1 generic and a forest. It's a creature, elf druid. You can tap the card to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. If Incubation Druid has a +1/+1 counter on it, add 3 mana of that type instead. And then you can also pay 5 to adapt 3. If this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, put 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Next we have Good Fortune Unicorn. It costs 1 generic, a forest, and a plains. It's a creature unicorn. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Catching even a glimpse of one is the start of 8 years of good luck. It's a 2/2. Sunscorch Regent costs 3 generic, 2 plains. It's a creature dragon, flying. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Sunscorch Regent, and you gain 1 life. This card is similar to the Hydra cards, but like dragon form. Flavor text reads, "We trust in the Scale Lords, bringers of justice that none can escape." Ooh. Hamza, Guardian of Irration. It costs 4 generic, a forest, and a plains. It's a legendary creature, Elephant Warrior. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. That is a very good card. And it's a 5/5. Defiler of Vigor cost 3 generic and 2 forest. Now, this is a creature Phyrexian worm. It has trample. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. These spells cost 1 forest less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of green mana you pay. Whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. It's a 6/6. I usually get this card when I play this deck for some reason. It's a pretty good card. I say that about just every card in here, but they really are just all so good together. Primordial Hydra. It costs X generic and 2 forest. It is a creature Hydra. Primordial Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of +1/+1 counters on Primordial Hydra. Primordial Hydra has trample as long as it has 10 or more +1/+1 counters on it. And it starts off as a 0/0. But again, Hydras grow very fast. Very fast. Now we have Abzan Battle Priest. This costs 3 generic and a forest. It's a creature human cleric. This also has Outlast. And you outlast for a plains, and then you tap and put a +1 counter on it. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has lifelink. And the flavor text reads, "Whenever I walk, the ancestors walk too." And then it's a 3/2. I like the art on this one. It's pretty cool. Cutsil Malamet Exemplar. This costs a generic, a forest, and a plains. It's a legendary creature, cat warrior. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. Whenever one or more creatures you control, each with power greater than its base power, deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. And it is a 3/3. Arwen, Weaver of Hope, costs 1 generic and 2 forest. It's a legendary creature, elf noble. I really like this card a lot. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1 counters on it equal to Arwen, Weaver of Hope's toughness. From afar, Arwen watched over Aragorn, and in hope she made for him a great and kingly standard. It's a 2/1. But if you can get counters on her, you're putting a lot of counters out on your creatures. Forgotten Ancient. It's a creature, elemental, costs 3 generic and a forest. Whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. It is a 0/3, and the flavor text reads, "Its blood is life, its body is growth." So inspirational. Rishkar Prima Renegade. Legendary creature, elf druid that costs 2 generic and a forest. When Rishkar Prima Renegade enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Each creature you control with a counter on it has tap and add a forest. Very nice indeed. I do like that. Next we have Champion of Lamholt. It costs a generic and 2 forest. This is a creature human warrior. It says creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt's power can't block creatures you control. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lambholt. Very good card here. Yeah. I must admit, most of this deck has green or white. Red is sort of just sprinkled in. But this is a really good red card to have in this deck. And this is Red Terror. It costs 3 generic and a mountain. It's a legendary creature, a Tyrannid. And whenever a red source you control deals damage to one or more permanents and or players, put a +1/+1 counter on the Red Terror. I think this card can help the deck combo out, which I really don't like using to win a game, because I think that it's not cheating, but it's a cheap way to win. Anyways, I've done it. Sorry. To those who I've played with this, but yeah, really good card. Kami of Whispered Hopes. It costs 2 generic and in a forest. Creature Spirit. If one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a permanent you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on that permanent instead. And then you can tap to add X mana of any one color, where X is Kami of Whispered Hope's power. It starts off as a 1/1. So, Kodama of the West Tree. It is 2 generic and a forest, a legendary creature spirit. It has reach. Modified creatures you control have trample, and modified creatures mean if it's equipped, or if it has an aura, or even counters are considered modifications. Whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it down to the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Renata Called to the Hunt. Cost 2 generic and 2 forest. It's a legendary enchantment creature. It's a demigod. Renata's power is equal to your devotion to green, and devotion to green means that each forest in the mana cost of permanents you control counts towards your devotion to green. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Very good. And she's an enchantment creature, so she is a mix between the two, which means we are now transitioning into enchantments. Next up we have Maya L's Aria, which costs a mountain, a forest, and a plains. It's an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. If you control a creature with power 5 or greater, then you gain 10 life. If you control a creature with power 10 or greater, then you win the game. If you control a creature with power 20 or greater. Crazy. And a way to win the game. Even with one card. Next we have Resourceful Defense. It's an enchantment. Whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. You can pay 4 in a plains and move any number of counters from target permanent you control to another target permanent you control. It's a pretty powerful card. We have Rhythm of the Wild, which is a generic mountain and a forest. It's an enchantment. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and non-token creatures you control have Riot, which Riot means that they enter the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter or haste. Ooh, very nice indeed. Next we have a Smothering Tithe. It's an enchantment. It costs 3 generic and a plains. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a treasure token. And that's where the tokens do come into play. So as you can see, there hasn't been too many tokens yet. All will be one, an enchantment, and it costs 3 generic and 2 mountain. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, all will be one deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. This is also a card that you can combo out with and definitely win the game with. It's a very strong card with this deck. Next up we have Doubling Season. This is a 4 generic cost with a forest. It's an enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. And if an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice that many on instead. So, as the name implies, it is doubling tokens and doubling counters. Very good card. Hardened Scales costs a forest. It's an enchantment, does something similar but strictly for counters. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. Just kidding, it just adds 1, but still. We have some flavor text here. Before me writhed the guardian of my prize, a serpent with stone skin and cunning eyes, a traveler's trials, hardened scales. The next enchantment we have is Court of Garenbrig. It costs a generic and 2 forest. When Court of Garenbrig enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. Again, another reason we have that token. At the beginning of your upkeep, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among up to 2 target creatures. Then, if you're the monarch, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Okay. Uncivil Unrest. Enchantment. Cost 4 generic and a mountain. Non-token creatures you control have Riot. If a creature you control with the +1/+1 counter on it would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage. Which, in this case, with the commander, since it has red in its color cost, it is considered a red creature or a red source dealing damage, so my commander would deal double that damage. I have one with that card too. Tribute of the World Tree. It costs 3 forest. Love the art. This is another enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card if its power is 3 or greater. Otherwise, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. There's some flavor text here as well. The tree was the heart of our world. It made me what I am and pulled me back from the brink of death. I won't allow it to be forgotten. Esika, god of the tree. Nice card. Okay. Here we are splitting and changing categories again. This is called an adventure spell where we have 2 things. So the left side is Ardenvale Fealty. It costs 1 generic and a plains. It's an instant adventure. Create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. The other side of the storybook is the enchantment, Virtue of Loyalty, and it is 3 generic, 2 forest. So that is at the beginning of your end step. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Untap those creatures. Very good. Very, very good. And this card works where if you cast the left side of the spell first, you exile the card, and then you can cast the right side of the book from exile onto the battlefield. It's a pretty cool card. I like adventure spells. Moving on into the instants now. Instants can be cast at any time, even not on your turn. This is Swords to Plowshares, a pretty common 1 cost, 1 plains. Instant. Exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. The flavor text reads, "The arc of my blade has curved a path of light for the peace that will follow." Very inspiring. We have Inspiring Call. Cost 2 generic and a forest. It's an instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. Now is the hour. Ours is the duty. For victory and family. Charge. Snakeskin Veil. It's an instant. It costs a forest. I really like the border of these cards. It looks really cool. You can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. The flavor text reads, "Never reject the kindness of a serpent. It will not be offered twice." That does seem like good advice. Thank you. Flawless Maneuver. It costs 2 generic and a plains. It's an instant. If you control a commander, you may cast the spell without paying its mana cost. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. That is a nice card to have in your back pocket. Not literally. Captain, your units are the tip of our spear. There is 0 room for failure. Heroic Intervention. I love this card. It costs a 1 generic and a forest. I think that might be a Johnny. And he's my planeswalker in this deck. We'll get to him soon. Okay, so this is an instant. Permanent you control gain hexproof with indestructible until end of turn. Wherever the strong would harm the weak, I will be there. Oh yeah, a Johnny Goldmane. Look at that. There he is. We of course have a worldly tutor in here, and it costs 1 forest. You get to search your library for a creature card and reveal that card, shuffle your library, then put the card on top of it. Very good card. We have the Enlightened Tutor. It costs 1 plains. You search your library for an artifact or enchantment card, reveal it, then shuffle and put the card on top. So similar to the Worldly Tutor, but specifically looking for artifacts and enchantments. Another common card is the Generous Gift. Destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token, and it costs 3 to cast. The best presents are impossible to regift. Okay, that one's pretty good. We have a Defiling Swat, and this is a 2 generic and a mountain. If you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. You may choose new targets for target spell or ability. Archmage attacks are little more than annoyances to Calamax. Dun, dun, dun. And then we also have an Achroma's Will. It costs 3 generic and a plains. Choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Creatures you control gain flying, vigilance, and double strike until end of turn, or creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible, and protection from all colors until end of turn. Both are great options, and if you control a commander, you get both. So very, very good card. Alright, we have Nature's Lore. It costs a generic and a forest. It's a sorcery where you get to search your library for a forest card and put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. A Blasphemous Act. It's another sorcery. This costs 8 generic and a mountain. But this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield. Blasphemous Act deals 13 damage to each creature. I dislike this card. It usually does not work to my advantage. Kodama's Reach, which is another good sorcery. It costs 2 and a forest. You can search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, and put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand, then shuffle. Flavor text reads, "The land grows only where the kami will." We also have a Cultivate in this deck, which is another sorcery where we can search for land. It costs 2 generic and a forest. We really want to make sure we can find all the land in this deck. Orishkar's Expertise. It costs 4 generic and 2 forest. It's a sorcery. You can draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and you may cast a spell with mana value 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. And that's very good. Flavor text reads, "Control the great conduit. You might as well try to divert a river with your hands." I think I'm missing a backstory there, but yes, sure. Good advice. Damning Verdict. It costs 3 generic and 2 plains. It's a sorcery. Destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Guilty as charged. Yes. These cards suck to have to play against, but I love them. Alright, we are moving into the artifacts now. This is Swift Boots, and Swift Boots is an equipment. Equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and equip 1, and in case you did not know, hexproof means it cannot be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. It costs 2 generic. We also have an arcane signet. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and it costs 2. We have a legendary artifact. This is the Ozolith, the Shattered Spire. It costs 1 generic and a forest. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1/+1/+1 there's too many +1s in there. +1 counters are put on it instead. You can pay 2 and tap, boop, and put a +1/+1 counter on target artifact or creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. And you can also choose to cycle the card for 2, where you pay 2 and then you can discard this card and draw a card. I don't know why you would cycle this. I mean, I guess if I had literally all the other cards that did the exact same thing, I might cycle it, but yeah. Bone Sabres. Whenever equipped creature attacks, put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. Equip 3. It costs 3. Okay. Sure thing. We also have a Basilisk Collar. Equipped creature has Death Touch and Lifelink, and you can pay 2 to equip it. It costs 1 to cast. Next we have a Soul Ring, where you can tap and add 2 colorless, or yeah, that's right, 2 colorless mana. We have the Great Henge. This costs 7 generic and 2 forest, but the spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. And then you can tap this to add 2 forest and gain 2 life. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. Yeah, this is a really good card to have in this deck because it's not too hard to get big creatures. So this would be pretty cheap to cast, I'm sure. We also have the Ozolith, which is a legendary artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. Flavor text reads, as it twists, so does all life around it. That's cool. That's pretty cool. Ah, my favorite, a Johnny the Great-Hearted. It cost 2 generic, a forest, and a plains. It's a legendary planeswalker. Creatures you control have vigilance, which is one of my favorites because that means that when it goes to attack, it does not tap, because typically when you declare an attacker, the creature taps. But when the creature has vigilance, it just attacks and it does not tap. You can +1 on the loyalty counter, and you will gain 3 life. You can -2 and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and a loyalty counter on each other planeswalker you control. And it starts with a 5 loyalty counter. Okay, so we have made it to all of the land cards, I am going to go through some of these, but I probably won't go through all of them. This is all of the forest and plains and mountains that we have for basic land. So a good amount of those. Again, you can check out the Mox field list in the description down below for the specific number that I have here. Otherwise, these are all of my special land cards that either kind of tap for multiple things or is of course a command tower. So we have the command tower and a reliquary tower. Both of those are pretty good staple land cards to have in a deck. This one you can add any color of your commander's color identity. And the reliquary tower is just a colorless mana, but you have no maximum hand size, which is really good. We also have Temple of Triumph, which enters tapped, I know, Orion Reef, the Vast Hood, Sungrass Prairie, Jetmir's Garden, Temple of Abandon, Fortified Village, Carplusian Forest, Karn's Bastion, Cinderglade, Game Trail, Mossfire Valley, Rogue's Passage, Fury Calm Snarl, Temple of Plenty, Boros Garrison, Jungle Shrine, Gavany Township, Canopy Vista, and Rockfall Vale. So those are all of the other special lands that we have within the deck as well. I hope that you enjoyed this video and this sort of like read through of my deck list for Shalai and Hallar. I think it turned out to be pretty relaxing. I certainly enjoyed making it for you. If you did enjoy the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more ASMR content. For now, I hope that you have a wonderful